Buenos días. Daros la bienvenida a esta Masterclass de William Raban. Bueno, primero que nada, disculpas por el retraso, pues hemos tenido aquí que solucionar algún tema técnico, pero bueno, ya estamos aquí y aquí está William Raban también, que creo que es muy interesante tenerle para esta Masterclass y más si habéis podido asistir al primer programa de sus películas, porque va a hablar de todo su proceso de trabajo y vamos a poder, creo que, llegar a entender mejor su obra y a empaparnos mejor de todo lo que significa su obra en la historia del cine. No voy a decir nada más, simplemente le voy a dar paso. Tenéis traducción simultánea para quien lo necesite. Si no lo habéis visto, lo que sea, pues en la puerta hay estos cascos para la traducción simultánea. Bueno, pues nada más, simplemente recibir a William Raban.
Welcome, everyone. I want to thank you, first of all, for coming. It's a great honor to be invited to do this presentation, and I want to thank Elena for inviting me to participate in the Mostra de Cinema Periférico in A Coruña. In this session, I shall talk about my practice and will show mostly short extracts from my films. And apologies that I'm having to do this rather unnatural thing of reading from notes, but it's necessary for the simultaneous translation. So it may not seem very spontaneous, and I apologize for that in advance. I'm going to start by saying something about myself and how I became involved in filmmaking. I studied painting at St. Martin's School of Art, and was influenced by the conceptual art movement that emerged in the late 1960s. I made my first films whilst at St. Martin's, and when I left, I joined the recently formed London Filmmakers Cooperative. In the early 1970s, I made a number of short landscape films, and expanded cinema performances. By expanded cinema, as you probably know, has two different meanings. There's the kind of Gene Youngblood version from America, which refers to films that expand consciousness, whereas in Europe, expanded cinema usually refers to films that have some kind of live performance element. And the live performance element can be either in the form of multi-screen projection or some kind of live performance taking place in front of the screen. Miguel, could you put the first slide up, please? 2 minutes, 45 seconds. It's going to take a little short interval, probably, to switch between images. So I'm now going to discuss the film performance work, 2 minutes, 45 seconds, an expanded cinema work for one camera and one projector that takes place over several days. It's a work where the making of the film and the screening of it became one and the same thing. This photograph shows a sequence of film strips, 3 days, of the first performance at Canary House in London in March 1973. On first projection, on the left, there's no film. I just switch on the projector for 2 minutes, 45 seconds. A sync sound camera placed at the back of the audience is set to run at the same time. I walk to the front of the screen on the opposite side of a microphone placed in front of the screen and announce the time, the date, and the place and say 2 minutes, 45 seconds. A camera is filming the audience watching the blank screen. Sounds of the projection and the audience's responses are being recorded. I would walk off and then maybe people would cough or talk. I processed that 100-foot of film as a black and white negative, usually in a tank. If we were doing film festivals, I'd process it immediately after the performance and hang it up to dry in the cinema. If I didn't hang it up in the cinema, I would hang it on a wooden rack that I'd made. And the next day, instead of the blank screen, I projected the film negative, as you can see in the middle film strip, that I had filmed the previous day. So what comes up on the screen is played synchronized with the sound recorded the previous day. The film negative image played on the screen, where you see me go up and saying the time, the place, and the rest, and me walking off. I refilmed this with a new 100-foot film in the camera from the back of the cinema. After seeing myself go off screen, I would go on again in real life and announce the title, the time, the date, and the place. 5 seconds. A camera is filming the audience, watching yesterday's audience, watching the film of the blank screen. Sounds of the projection and the audience's responses are being recorded. It built up like that, and when you film a negative image, you get a positive. After several days, when it filled up the whole screen, with me going on and off in different iterations, that would be the point where I ended it. Sometimes it would go on for 10 days. So it became like a Dutch picture, with the screens within screens receding towards infinity with each iteration. This isn't part of the masterclass. I'm not sure what's happening. Good, thanks. No matter how many times it's performed, it remains only 2 minutes 45 seconds long. It contains all of its previous iterations within that time frame. During the 1970s, I made many performances of 2 minutes 45 seconds, but by the mid-80s, I stopped showing the work, and given that the film performance could only be shown in the live context, the work disappeared. If I could have the first JPEG, please. Sorry, not the first one, the second one, the 2 minutes 45 seconds. Here we go. This is a drawing from my sketchbook that I've reversed out. I've made the whites black and the blacks white to make it more clearly visible. And this was my first sort of conceptual drawing for the work. If I could have the next JPEG, please. And I don't know if you can read this. It's a little small, but I wanted to draw it out. This is, again, from my notebook, or a typed page that I cut into my notebook. And it says here, this is repeated, but after each screening, the old film material is discarded. And it says here, camera, projector, waste. And that's why I felt I couldn't really use any of the film performances of 2 minutes 45 seconds as documentation, because the idea was kind of vital to me, that as soon as the film had been put through a projector, unless I was refilming it had to be discarded. The revival of interest in expanded cinema during the 2000s led to people wanting to see the original work, but I had already determined that the film could only ever be shown if it was being refilmed. This led me to make a new version of 2 minutes 45 seconds that could be shown as documentation after its completion. I decided to make the new version on 35mm color negative. The reason for the change of title is that 2 minutes 45 seconds refers to the duration of a 100-foot roll of 16mm film, whereas 4 minutes 22 seconds is the duration of a 400-foot roll of 35mm film. Also, what I quite liked about doing, there were two things that I particularly liked about doing this new version on 35mm. One, the length of the standard roll, 400 feet, 4 minutes, 22 seconds, is close to John Cage's durational work, 4 minutes, 33 seconds. So it makes that connection with John Cage more obvious. And the other thing I liked about it was that I didn't know, although I'd done this as a 16mm version many, many times, I didn't know how it would work with color negative. In theory, between each iteration, it should go color positive, color negative, color positive, but I wanted to do it to find out whether it would work that way or not. The new version was performed and refilmed over 6 days during December 2008 at the BFI National Film Theatre in London, culminating in the final day's presentation for Expanded Cinema, the Live Record Symposium, BFI South Bank, 6th of December 2008. And Miguel, if you could please show that poster, which is the next JPEG. This is documentation from the live record. And I mentioned that there was this kind of revival of interest in our early work from the 70s in 2000, and it started with an exhibition at the ICA, the Whitechapel Gallery in East London. There was a big exhibition about conceptual art, in which Expanded Cinema from the 70s formed an important part of the art to the beginning of the revival. That was in 2000. And then very soon after, Mark Webber organized his shoot programs that ran at Tate Modern. And then there were many small and larger exhibitions, both in England and in Europe, that reevaluated Expanded Cinema. Particularly X-Screen in Vienna was one such exhibition, and this was at the National Film Theatre. It was a one-day symposium. And if we could please play the DVD now, Miguel, thank you. I'm showing 4 minutes, 22 seconds.
Camera ready. NFT 3, BFI South Bank, on Wednesday, 3rd of December 2008. A camera is filming the audience, watching the film of yesterday's audience, watching the film of Monday's audience, watching the blank screen. Sounds of the projection and the audience's responses are being recorded. Four minutes, 22 seconds. NFT 3, BFI South Bank, on Thursday, 4th of December 2008. A camera is filming the audience, watching the film of yesterday's audience, watching the film of Tuesday's audience, watching the film of Monday's audience, watching the blank screen. Sounds of the projection and the audience's responses are being recorded. minutes, 22 seconds, NFT 3, BFI South Bank, on Saturday, 6th of December, 2008. A camera is filming the audience, watching the film of Thursday's audience, watching the film of Wednesday's audience, watching the film of Tuesday's audience, watching the film of Monday's audience, watching the blank screen. Sounds of the projection and the audience's responses are being recorded. 4 minutes, 22 seconds is the running time of a 400-foot roll of 35mm film. This is a new work based on 2 minutes, 45 seconds that was first performed at Canary House, London, in March 1973.
I made 4 minutes 22 seconds with the express intention that the final iteration would serve as future documentation of the work. The 4 minutes 22 documentation is available to be shown as a DVD. And I think it raises the whole question as to whether one can indeed document expanded cinema films and performances. I always think there's a real difference between anything that's documented and the actual thing itself. Under the right circumstances, provision of camera, tripod and sound recording equipment, I would consider representing this as a live work performed and refilmed over several days. However, I would now do this as a digital work and not use, I've got here outmoded 16mm or 35mm film, but perhaps I should delete outmoded because I'm sure there'll be many people in this audience who would disagree with me on that point. The essential concept in making of 2 minutes 45 seconds and its later iteration 4 minutes 22 seconds is that the film performance is devoid of all content except for the making of the film in the cinema. The time of film production and the time of film exhibition become collapsed together into the same time frame. And the history of all the film's performances is contained within the single screen image. It's reflexive in the sense that 2 minutes 45 seconds and 4 minutes 22 seconds are nothing more and nothing less than being about the filmmaking and film screening process. And reflexivity is one of the key aspects of both structural film and expanded cinema. 1973 was a high point for experimental film in England. There were several large-scale exhibitions in London and other parts of the country, such as Film Action at the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool, and further events at the Edinburgh Film Festival. I will show next the film performance Take Measure that was first performed in 1973. It measures the seemingly intangible space between the film projector and the cinema screen. The measurements you will see on the screen are in feet, although most of Most of the world has now gone metric. Feet as a unit of length remains the standard measurement of the length of film rolls the world over. And that's because there are exactly 16 film frames to every foot of 35mm film, and exactly 40 film frames to every 16mm foot of film. So this is a risky performance. This is the kind of high point of danger in this today, because I'm hoping this is going to work. So take a measure. Yeah, if you could just have the lights on the stage, great, thank you. And the house lights off. Thank you. Thank you. Take measure. Thank you. Going to the movies as a child, I was amazed by the interior space of the cinema. It always seemed so much bigger on the inside of the building than the outside. Even before the film started, the disorientation in spatial dimensions in this temple of illusionism hit me the moment I entered. I remember being struck that it was hard to think of the dimensions of the cinema interior in measurable terms at all. This childhood memory was the starting point for making the film Take Measure. It was an obvious way of returning a sense of tangible space to the cinema. It's not just about the space and distance, but also to do with the materiality of time. The bigger the cinema, the longer will be the performance of Take Measure. Take Measure also deals with the physicality and the performativity of the film medium. There was a central concern of structural film and expanded cinema during the 1970s. In Europe, structural film was understood as a cinema zero, reimagining film history as if it hadn't made the right turn into narrative, but took instead a sharp left into an exploration of the materiality of the film medium itself, the elemental basics, projected light, celluloid, and the photographic emulsion. Expanded cinema was an offshoot of structural film that involved some performative interaction with the film projection, either by using more than one screen or by some aspect of live performance during the projection. My two-screen angles of incidence is one example. The film performance take measure is another. And Miguel, if you could please put up the fifth still image. I'm just going to talk about two other expanded performances that I did in the 70s. Do I have a problem? Else just told me, sorry, we have to wait maybe 2 minutes for the projector to come back on because it was turned off for the film performance. So I'm going to, maybe I should talk a little bit about the images I'm about to show. The first is a still image of the performance of the 3-screen film, Diagonal. And it's a very short piece. It's about 4 or 5 minutes long. And again, I first performed that at Gallery House in 1973. And it was quite a precarious projection because I only had one film print. And that film print ran through 3 projectors. So it was precarious for this reason, that if the projector at the end of the series was running faster than the 2 projectors before, the film would snap. And also the other thing is that it was the sound for the piece was first of all done improvised at Gallery House, and the sound was made by fellow filmmaker David Crosswaite using the Moog synthesizer. I'm sorry I can't show the film here, but I'm not going to show the film again until at least I've got digital restorations of it, because I've only got the original print from the 1970s, and if that gets destroyed, the film disappears. And after that, I'm going to show the 5-screen wave formations piece, which once the image is up on screen, I'll give you a little explanation as to how that works. It's probably the simplest film I've made in many ways. Sorry for the pause. I'd be very pleased to answer any questions if you've got any questions. Yes. Okay. Shall I talk a little bit about film action? Yeah. Yeah, I'll talk about that. Thank you very much. Yes, I've just been asked to give a little explanation about Film Action, which is a group I was part of. And although the exhibition at Gallery House, where 2 minutes 45 seconds was first performed, that exhibition wasn't called Film Action. That core group of people formed Film Action after that event. And then our first public exhibition was at the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool in the same year, 1973. And the core people in film action were Malcolm Legrice, Jill Etherly, Annabelle Nicholson, David Crosswaite, and myself. And we performed a number of shows, though in the written record, it's often, that first show at Gallery House is often referred to as the first exhibition of film action, but it wasn't really. That happened a few months later. Does that answer your question? Any other questions? The body of the audience. Yeah, I think this is really important, and I remember at one of the screenings I was at, this question of embodied camera came up. I think it was in relation to Saul's program. Did you raise that question with Saul about the embodied camera? Right. Okay. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a really vital part, actually. And I think you're right. I think my memory of the cinema as a child was very much thinking about the space impinging upon my body. And certainly, you know, performing the film now into a live audience, I think there is some sort of sense of embodiment. And part of the risk is that somebody might grab hold of the film as it's traveling back through the audience and pull the projector over. Because the film stock on this print is polyester, so it won't break unless you cut it. So it's physically risky as well. I mean, when I first performed it at the National Film Theatre, they had to have a team of senior management come down to a test screening in order to satisfy themselves that there was no risk of physical harm to the audience. It's quite good. But I mean, and the question of embodiment has become an issue of increasing interest for me. We don't seem to be getting the projector back. Let me just quickly go and check and see how long this delay is going to be, if I may. Got a 1 minute from now. 1 minute from now. Okay. I've just been informed it's 1 minute from now.
Hola.
Just finishing off your question about embodiment. I mean, the way I like to think about this is also in terms of reflexivity. And the concept of reflexivity has been really important to me in thinking, and mostly in retrospect about work that I've made. But this idea that the understanding of reflexivity in the social sciences has a slightly different meaning to the way we understand it in artistic practice. And I think the obvious example in artistic practice might be the glorious painting by Velázquez, Las Meninas, where you actually see the whole subject of the painting is the artist painting the canvas that we're witnessing. So it's this kind of self-referentiality as reflexivity. But in sociology and the social sciences, reflexivity acknowledges the researcher's impact in researching their subjects, which before this idea of reflexivity came into anthropology, for example, it was considered bad practice for there to be any kind of acknowledgement of the extent to which the researcher themselves might have influence on the people they were investigating. I like that because in the 1970s, I remember, there were an awful lot of what I thought were quite boring films made, where the camera never left the tripod and the scene was left to run, without any cuts, without any movements, and understanding reflexivity from the social sciences perspective suddenly made it permissible to take that camera off the tripod and to actually feel that there was the person behind the camera. So it gives this sense of first-person perspective. So we've got the screen back on, which is wonderful. So Miguel, if you could kindly show image 5, please, which is diagonal. Yeah, this is the diagonal arrangement. It's 3 overlapping screens. And this is actually an image, rather a grainy image, because it was filmed in low light, photographed in low light in a steel plant in Dortmund. It was one of the screenings that Mark Webber organized. And the 3 screens are overlapping. And the extent of the overlap is very much determined by the space. If we could have the next screen, please, Miguel, it's wave formations. So what's happening here is that the film in each of these 5 projectors is just continuous fades made in the printer. No camera was used in making this film. I made this film by giving instructions to a film laboratory, which made me long series of fades from black to white. The fade lasted 96 frames, so it's, 4 seconds. Just going from clear film to black film. And in projection, the film on these 2 projectors at the side that are projecting crossways onto the screen, they're film loops of the cycle of fade from black to white. And they don't have any color filters on. But the 3 projectors in the center have color gels in front of the lens. And so it becomes also to do with the mixing of additive color. So the center, let's get this right. The center projector has the green filter. The right projector has the blue filter. And the left projector has the red filter. Why? I was thinking of ship navigation, that traditionally red is always port. And you could argue, if I was taking that analogy to extremes, this screen should be green because green is starboard. But it's not. The green is in the middle. So green overlapped with red produces yellow. And there it's producing an orange only because there's more of the fade towards black on the green, whereas the red is completely clear. So I think structural film principles are evident in the next short film clip from Autumn Scenes that I made in 1977. So if you could please show the next film clip, clip number 2, Miguel. There's no sound on this clip, by the way. There's no sound on the film. It was made as a silent film. These freeze frames are unintentional. It's part of the projection. Yeah. Sorry about the freeze frames. Actually, I quite like them. But I wouldn't normally show it like that. So I filmed a continuous tracking shot of a dancer walking down a street where the doors and windows of the houses had been bricked up to prevent squatters living there. And if we could have the next JPEG, please, which is number 7, Miguel. I need to explain how the cuts work. So this, if you imagine that this is the film strip from beginning to end, the film is cut at every point in the film strip where the dancers' legs were at full stride. Each small section of film was then flipped over and respliced back into the roll. So it then looked like this, with each individual shot upside down, but it's still in the same sequence. This turns the image upside down, so the film had to be played from the end back to the beginning. So that's how it ends up in the edit, and the whole thing is flipped over to turn the shots back the right way. In summary, whilst each short section of the film plays forwards, overall, the film progresses backwards in time from the end back to the beginning. What interests me in this film is not so much the structural aspects of the film created by the rhythms of the film cutting procedure, but the effect this has on the film content. The row of derelict houses painted with political slogans directed against the local council and against the celebrations of the Queen of England's Silver Jubilee. The rhythmic fracturing of time has the effect of turning the political elements in the film into a concrete poem. In one sense, Fergus Walking is all about the materiality of the film strip and what can be done with it in terms of a simple editing procedure. And it relies, of course, on the persistence of vision that, you know, the eye fools one because one sees what looks like continuous movement. I'm only making cuts when his legs are apart. The eye is always looking for continuity, but then you see this sort of flipping background. But in another, perhaps more important sense, it becomes about how the edit procedure works in relation to particular film content. In this case, a street in a poor part of London where the house fronts have been bricked up to prevent squatters living there. I made a number of structural films and expanded cinema performances through the 70s, but reached a point where it seemed impossible to carry the project further. Being engaged in a cinema zero seemed to have reached a point of extreme minimalism, where the ultimate goal was the white rectangle of a blank screen. This is the point at which content started to have a bigger presence in my films, first through experiments with narrative form, and then becoming drawn to more documentary forms of content. I would argue, however, that the work made after 1980 remains informed by a structuralist approach towards the materiality of the film medium. It's distinct from more mainstream forms of filmmaking because I never set out to make a work that entertains, but try instead to make a film that engages the audience. That distinction between entertainment and engagement is crucial to me. A consistent theme running through my work is a concern for observing and documenting changes taking place in the London environment where I've lived through my adult life. I don't make a film by starting with a script, but I develop a process of close observation that involves walking, making notes and drawings, and sometimes taking photographs. I've spent the last 40 years living and working in East London. It's an area that has seen a massive regeneration during that time. Traditionally, it was a white working class neighborhood where many families were sustained by work in the docks bordering the River Thames. Much of the housing in the area had not been properly repaired since it had been bombed in the Second World War, which meant that the area had fallen into decline. During the 1970s, the dock trade largely disappeared because of containerization. And so the East End of London suffered high levels of poverty and unemployment. Margaret Thatcher's Conservative government mobilised vast amounts of private capital to regenerate the whole of London's docklands. The centrepiece of this project was the building of Canary Wharf Tower, which was to become England's new hub for global new hub for global capital. Constructed from glass and stainless steel, the Canary Wharf Tower was at that time the tallest building in Europe. I had watched the tower being built, and as it neared completion, it occurred to me that it was like the gnomon of a sundial. Casting great swathes of East London under its shadow. The Conservative government's so-called regeneration of London's docklands had a devastating impact upon the local population. The new jobs created for the financial institutions around Canary Wharf offered little to the local community. There were few jobs for unskilled workers, except perhaps for cleaners and security guards. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? I made this film Sundial in response to the opening of the Canary Wharf Tower in 1992. During each of the 72 shots making up the film, the tower is always held center frame. Whilst it is the social contrasts in the foreground areas of the frame that I was interested in capturing, as David Curtis noted, Raban's homage to the bankrupt Canary Wharf Tower, London's conspicuous monument to the Thatcher years, ironically suggests it might have found a purpose as a means for telling the time. As his camera repositions itself to track the sweep of the sun, Raban incidentally documents the old East End, which the Docklands development was supposed to replace. The Arts Council and BBC Television jointly commissioned the film for a programme of 1-minute films made by artists. Miguel, if you could please show Sundial now. You've copied these onto the desktop. Yeah? Sorry? You copied my films onto your desktop. Ah, they're playing from the hard drive. Yeah. These are jumps in the film. We're going to play it from the beginning. Miguel thinks he knows what might be the cause of the problem. It's the software it's being played through. Sorry. Are we running short on time? Thanks. Miguel's fixed the problem, which is great. So when I conceived the film, I thought it had something in common with the two-screen film, Angles of Incidence, that I'd made in 1973. In Angles of Incidence, the camera rotates short intervals of film within a room. Sorry, the camera records short intervals of film within a room. The camera rotated around an axis formed by the center of the window through which I was filming, whereas in Sundial, the axis of rotation is the Canary Wharf Tower, which is the main subject of the film. Rapid development of former dockland communities carried on throughout the 1990s. Old estates of social housing were demolished and their place was taken by new luxury housing developments. After making Sundial, I realized it was important to continue the process of documenting the changes taking place in this part of London. A13, 1994, shows a day in the life of the city, and in its use of matte shots and other in-camera effects, it was in part a homage to Ziga Vertov's Man with a Movie Camera, 1929. I'm inspired by Vertov and agree with his conviction that cinema can truly be a universal language. I wanted to take this interest one step further, to see the extent to which it might be possible to construct meaning without the use of words, but through the use of image and sound alone. Like Sundial, A13 was shot in the vicinity of Canary Wharf Tower, with a focus on the Limehouse Road Link Tunnel, which swept away large areas of council housing. All my films until 2002 were made on 16mm film. And you can see in A13 how I used several of Ziga Vertov's in-camera montage techniques for particular effect. The in-camera superimpositions can be seen as another example of using the materiality of the film medium to create political meaning. Here is the ending of the film, an aggressive coda driven by fast drums on the soundtrack. Miguel, if you could please play number 4, which is A13. Thank you. So A13 includes shots of anti-Nazi League demonstrators outside the town hall that you see at the end there, and they're protesting at the election of a British National Party, a BNP candidate. I should just say that the BNP, for those of you who may not know, is the extreme right-wing movement, political party in England. And they just had one of their councillors elected to East London. This political triumph for the BNP was accompanied by an increase in attacks on the local Bengali population and formed the starting point for making Island Race in 1996. Here again, I was concerned to use just image and sound to convey political meaning. This time, I proposed making a film that was a chronicle of ordinary events taking place on the streets of Tower Hamlets, the area of East London where I live. It was impossible to predict exactly what would happen in the film because it depended to a large extent on spontaneous actions and events that could not be foreseen. In Island Race, the audience sees everything in the order in which it happened. This is because the film is in the form of a chronicle, and it would have destroyed the sense of events unfolding in time if the strict chronological sequence had not been followed. This extract starts with a radio news bulletin about one of the racist attacks on a Bengali boy in Tower Hamlets. A few news bulletins from Sunrise Radio, the main radio station listened to by the Asian community, were included in the film to give specific context to what is being shown. If we could play Island Race, please, Miguel. Could we play it full frame? I think A13 was slightly smaller.
Asian world at one. Shah Alam needed a life support machine to survive a racist attack in Limehouse last year. 8 months later, the teenager still hasn't fully recovered. Now he and his family are struggling to come to terms with the collapse of the court case against the 5 white youths charged with his attempted murder. Thames magistrates ruled that there was no case to answer. Shah's family say that they've lost faith in British justice. Sunrise Radio.
Racist parties out!
asked Miguel to make that extract a little shorter because it's the last long shot I want to talk about. So most of my 16mm films, I'm mentioning this partly because Nicky Hamlin and several other people have talked about the wonders of the Bolex camera. For me, all my 16mm films were shot on an Arriflex ST camera. I did start to use the Bolex in the 1970s, but I never found any affection for the camera. I didn't like it for reasons that if you want to know, I'll tell you privately. But I much prefer the Arri ST. The Arri ST is a beautiful camera. They're old, but much better in terms of their mechanics, so far as I'm concerned, and can be used. They're excellent for filming in a way that you can't be observed easily on the street. For preference, I use a motor that can run at variable speed and can also run in reverse. When filming, I often decide to undercrank the camera slightly for a particular reason. There is a good example of this in the Ronnie Kray funeral sequence in Island Race. The Kray twins were London's biggest gangsters who were sentenced to life in prison in 1969. When it became apparent that there would be a massive funeral for Ronnie Kray after his death in Broadmoor Prison, and Broadmoor Prison, incidentally, is the prison for the criminally insane, I decided to film the funeral for a key sequence in Island Race. The longest shot in the film, 92 seconds, is the cortege of 15 funeral limousines approaching the church in East London. It was a small traffic island backed by a tall street sign where I set up the camera on a tripod. Traffic island created an obstacle for the thronging crowd advancing up the street. And for this reason, I knew the police would be unlikely to move me on for creating an obstruction. Before switching on the camera, I decided to film at 20 frames per second rather than the normal 24. I did this in order to speed the shot up slightly, since I knew that this was already going to be an exceptionally long shot. The speeded up effect had another unintended consequence. It made the footage look like old archive material because of the quickened movements of the crowd. Audiences often remark on the effectiveness of this shot, partly because the sun suddenly emerges behind cloud as the cortege comes into view to backlight the whole procession. I think I'm going to add something to what I've got here, and that is that with the Under the Tower trilogy, Sundial is the first part, A13 the second, and Island Race the third. I had to develop disguises in order to get many of the shots I needed. I had to sometimes go onto private land where building work was carried out, and sometimes I was filming people in a way that I didn't want them to know that I was filming them, which also raises ethical issues. But it meant that I had to adopt sometimes quite discreet disguises. And the disguise that worked best for me was to wear a big yellow reflective jacket, big boots, and a hard hat, like builders wear, or I dressed like a builder on a building site. And it helped that the tripod I was using was an ancient BBC tripod made out of wood. And the camera, I never shoot with a magazine on the camera. I always shoot on 100-foot spools of film. So the camera itself is quite small. And I only ever filmed with prime lenses, and the lenses are small. So to the casual observer, because of the way I'm dressed, I look like a surveyor with a theodolite. And it was amazing the places I was able to get to without anyone challenging me. And as a strategy, I never ask for permission, because it's very difficult now to get official permission to film in London, because if you do, the first thing they ask you for is a fee. Okay. I'm not going to pay anyone a fee to get shots. As far as I'm concerned, and this kind of answers partly the ethical question that you might be considering, is it right to film people without their knowledge? I only film people going about their business in the public domain. And if they're in the public domain, I don't see any problem of invasion of privacy if I film them. But you might want to challenge me about that after this is over. So I made the film About Now Double MX, which I showed in the program on Thursday, 14 years later after Island Race. And the double MX in the title is the date 2010, represented as Roman numerals. I saw the process of filming in time-lapse whilst the camera tracked in either horizontal pans or vertical tilts as being an attempt to create a cinematic map of the City of London. This photograph, if you could please put up the JPEG number 8, please, Miguel, shows the camera rig. So I made the film on the 21st floor of a tower block in East London, the Balfron Tower. And what was special for the film was I had to use this, it's called a geared head. And that means that the tilting movements of the camera are controlled by turning this wheel. And you might just see that around the rim of the wheel, I've made markings, equal distance markings, that enabled me, because the film was shot in almost entirely single frame, it enabled me to make small incremental movements of the camera. And similarly, the wheel on the other side of the camera, of this wheel, is the one that controls panning movements. And you can see that there's the camera I was using was designed for live action, but I was using it mostly single frame, so it's got an animation motor with the cables that you can see on the side of the camera. So, as I mentioned, it was filmed from a flat on the 21st floor of a tower block in East London, and is quite different from my other London films because of the aerial viewpoint, looking down at the subjects I was filming. Natural landscape is a recurring feature in About Now Double MX. Earlier in the film, there are the shots of reed beds in the tidal waters of Bow Creek, where ducks float across the frame. I selected those framings partly because they reference the film View, the first film that I'd made in 1970. There are other, more potentially natural images in the film. The successive shots of the enlarged moonrises and moonsets are one example. The repeated sunsets towards the end of the film are another. The sun passes diagonally across the frame, and as it does so, it disappears into the dense bank of smog hanging over the horizon. Filming in time-lapse through a powerful telephoto lens enhances the material presence of air pollution on the London skyline. These shots of the sunsets draw attention to ecological issues and environmentalism by showing the way in which the city is becoming enveloped by pollution. This is particularly noticeable in the ending of the sequence, where the sun disappears and it gets dark before the sun even reaches the horizon. The shots of the full moon mark the months of shooting. The film starts with several ascents of the moon, and towards the end of the film there are several descents falling away towards the western skyline. Both the sun and moon trace a diagonal movement as they pass across the static frame. Those are the only diagonal movements in the film, and counter the strictly observed horizontal panning and vertical tilting movements of the camera, as you'll see in this extract. And if we could have the 6th video, please, Miguel, about now MX. I think About Now MX can be seen in terms of the structural film experiments of the 1970s, such as two-screen angles of incidence. You could see from that extract that there is a perceptible roughness to some of the camera movements. This is especially evident in the shots where an extreme telephoto lens was used. Even when the camera is locked off in a static position, the moon crossing the frame appears to judder slightly. In planning the film, I considered using motorized camera movements controlled by computer to give a smooth glissando effect, but I deliberately chose to move the camera by hand because I wanted a sense of an embodied camera rather than a mechanized movement. The viewing experience reveals the frame-by-frame process by which the film was made. To clarify what I mean by this, I'm suggesting that the frame-by-framiness being evident in the viewing experience is opposed to the more prevalent view of time in film as continuous present. It's related to reflexivity in the sense that the audience becomes simultaneously aware of both the illusion presented on screen and of the means by which the illusion is constructed. So to distinguish this from the notion of time as continuous present, I refer to the frame-by-framiness alternative as fragmentary time that is linked to materiality of the film medium. And I think that kind of, if I don't know how you're translating, dear translator, how you're coping with this term frame-by-framiness, but I do think that's what, something that a lot of structural films in the 70s were very much concerned with. And I think particularly of the films by Paul Sharits, where, it's very much to do with, the motion picture film is constructed of static still frames. So while shooting the film, I was thinking that there were similarities to what I was doing, and some of the paintings by Piet Mondrian of New York City, such as New York Boogie Woogie, 1944. Mondrian is renowned for his refusal of the diagonal, making his paintings on a strict grid-like structure, comprised entirely of horizontal and vertical lines. Miguel, if you could please put up, it says here incorrectly, it's a video, it's not, it's a JPEG image, not the 9th JPEG, please, which is the Mondrian. Yes, this is New York Boogie Woogie by Mondrian. When I was at school, I was really taken by Mondrian's paintings, and I'd only ever seen his paintings in reproduction in books. And it was a bit of a shock to me when I first saw the actual Mondrian paintings in an art gallery and saw how rough the edges are. Because in reproduction, the edges tend to look absolutely pristine and perfect. And I'm not even sure that he used masking tape in a lot of these paintings. And so that was quite a revelation to me, was how painterly they were. They weren't graphic in the way that I had assumed them to be. So there's no voice or commentary on the soundtrack, but I do see About Now MX as being a political film. Like Highland Race, the movements you see on screen were all edited in the order in which they happen. In some ways, the film is quite similar to footage from a surveillance camera. This is partly to do with the magnified view of the telephoto lens, and partly the elevated height of the camera perspective, looking down on the people and streets below. About Now MX was filmed on 35mm film. Up until 2010, all my films had been made on either 16 or 35mm film. In England, it's now impossible to get film prints made, since most cinemas no longer project film, so demand for it has collapsed. no longer, digital projection has become ubiquitous. I can't imagine that I will make another film on 35 millimeter. I have to accept it is old technology. Sadly, digital filmmaking is not the same, but it has so many advantages, notably low-cost production, increased speed of production, and excellent image and sound quality. My own recent experience shows the creative and economic benefits that digital film production can bring. In some ways, it's a different language to old analog forms of filmmaking. I can't hold the digital files up to the light of still images like I could with 16 or 35 millimeter film. The digital movie files stored on a hard drive don't seem to have any materiality. Working entirely within the analog domain of film production, the traces and imperfections within the process cannot be easily erased. And certainly, in terms of structural filmmaking, the so-called errors and mistakes become part of the viewing experience of the film. In structural film theory, the idea of the indexical signifier was used to describe the ways in which the production process was made manifest on the screen. This has to do with the essential materiality of the film medium and the fact that the traces of any intervention having been made would always leave its trace. At the simplest level, any film print shown in a cinema will gather scratches and dust particles over time, so that after many film screenings, these accumulated imperfections, the dust and scratches, can be read as the indexical traces of all the film's previous performances. Digital is fundamentally different because it has no materiality in the same way as film. If the analog film process is about inscription, then digital film seems to be about erasure. The image can be manipulated in post-production in such a way that it is impossible to detect the interventions that have been made. The digital file can be projected countless times, and it'll always be essentially the same experience, with no dust, scratches, or other imperfections. So one cannot talk about the indexical signifier in the same way as with film. This seems to be relatable to art production in general. Art seems to be becoming increasingly dematerialized. Production increasingly happens in a virtual space that is less concerned with the making of physical and tactile objects than with streaming data primarily for internet distribution. I sincerely hope, you can see some progression from my early experiments in structural film and expanded cinema to the more recent works that have a more socio-political perspective, specifically with regard to London. I started making films from a minimalist position and would like to think that a minimalist approach to production is evident in films such as A13, Island Race, Time and the Wave, for example. I'm going to conclude by showing a very short political provocation that I made over a month ago. It's the first work that I've made specifically for the internet. I see this as a satirical fairy tale. And although it's meant to be ironic, it might be seen as being more didactic than my previous work. It is extremely minimal, containing just one shot with a voiceover. Miguel, if you could please play London Republic, the last of the clips. Once the Queen Queen had been removed to Windsor, Buckingham Palace became a homeless centre. In fine weather, the royal gardens offered further sanctuary. By 24th of June, with the count nearly over, it was clear that all of England except London had voted to leave the EU. Scotland and London voted substantially to remain. The constitutional crisis of a divided nation lasted until September, when the Greater London Assembly approved legislation to make London an independent republic committed to remaining in Europe. The Glasstone building of London City Hall by Tower Bridge became the Republican seat of government, whilst the old Houses of Parliament accommodated refugees and migrants. The Republic was defined within the perimeter of the M25. The old country became the happy home of little Englanders who doted on their monarchy and enjoyed their ancient customs. Londoners appreciated their newfound freedoms and self-governance. They were pleased to be rid of the old pageantry, the Lord Mayor's show, and trooping the colour. The divorce was surprisingly amicable, with England being given total control of the armed and security services. London saw no need for a Ministry of Defence and was pleased to be shot of the Trident nuclear deterrent. Like the Queen, the former Tory government was removed to England, and Boris Johnson tried to lead his fractured party from his new constituency in Witney, deep in rural Oxfordshire. And just to sort of finally put a little, I'm sorry it was played so loud, I hope it didn't deafen you. I'm getting a bit hard of hearing, so it's fine for me. I just wanted to list a series of 2 questions followed by 2 statements that I see myself as trying to address in my work. How can audience participation be activated? I think this is a key question, not just for me, but for lots of people. This is specifically relevant to films that seek to engage rather than entertain their audiences. And the second question would be, how can we make political films? I'm also thinking here of Jean-Luc Godard and his say that the question is not how to make political cinema, but how to make films politically. And 2 statements. Never tell this is what I'm always trying to tell myself, never tell the audience how to interpret the work. The work must remain open, and don't preach. I don't think about aesthetics in relation to my work. I'm very troubled by the whole modern notion of aesthetics. As German performance artist Uhle said, aesthetics without ethics are cosmetics. I wish I'd thought of that. Finally, I want to reiterate that it's a real privilege for me to be able to share my works and thoughts with you here in A Coruña. Thank you very much.
Bueno, temos agora ainda uns minutos se alguén quere hacer alguna pregunta del público. Sí.
Hello.
Hi.
Thanks for your presentation. I have a kind of comment regarding your very first piece, 245, because I was surprised about this temporal moment in the late 60s and early 70s in which If I remember correctly, you made in 72
I had the idea for it in 1972. I first performed it in March 1973.
and also Albin Lucier with the
Yes.
piece I Am a Sitting in a Room was, I think, composed in 69 and first performed in 70.
Yeah.
Both pieces work to some extent with the given space and time and self-reflexivity of the audience. So I wonder about your opinion regarding this moment in which I think a lot of contemporary artists were working these ideas.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I wasn't aware, and I'm not sure that my colleagues at the London Filmmakers Co-op were aware of Alvin Lucier at that time. Only later that we became aware of his work. Certainly John Cage, the 4 minutes, 33 seconds, which I think is actually 1950s, mid-1950s, 53, 54, 55. I think that has to be seen as the antecedent to all this way of working. And one can see it as part of the evolution of conceptual art. Because I think there were other artists, I've forgotten his name, who used to, Victor Bergin did a lot of work which is relatable to the same questions, though done in a very different way in terms of a gallery exhibition of still photographs and objects. So thank you for your question, it's a good one.
Thank you. ¿Alguna otra pregunta? Bueno, pues simplemente queremos agradecerle a William que haya estado esta mañana con nosotros. Thank you very much for such an inspiring masterclass. Fantastic. Y a los demás, pues invitaros hoy por la tarde a que asistáis al resto de proyecciones que va a haber en el CEGA, en la sala Palexco. Y por la noche a las 11 menos cuarto, el performance de Nicky Hamlin en la Fundación Luis Evane. Muchas gracias.